Chains, a breeding machine, an alien girl on the edge of despair, until a human storms in. Welcome to HFY Vanguard. The story begins now. The sterile light of the laboratory burned into Tyra's retinas, sharp and merciless, as though the illumination itself sought to peel back her defenses. She blinked furiously against the glare, but there was no refuge. Her wrists strained against the restraints that held her to the cold chair's smooth metal, designed not for comfort, but for containment. The cuffs had already cut into her blue skin, leaving faint lines of purple blood that dripped down to her forearms. She tried twisting, pulling anything that might shift the unyielding bonds, but the chair had been engineered to hold even the strongest of species. To it, she was nothing more than a delicate specimen. Her breaths came shallow, rapid. The sterile chill of the room clung to her skin, damp with sweat. Her silver-white hair, usually a mark of elegance in lion society, now hung disheveled across her face, strands plastered to her damp cheeks. Tyra fought the urge to scream, though fear rattled her bones. A scream would change nothing. Her captors would only observe, note her behavior, perhaps even feed off the evidence of her terror. She had been a diplomat, her whole life trained to control expression and posture. But never had her discipline been tested this cruelly. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking under the strain. "I am a daughter of the Astral Council. My people will pay whatever ransom you demand." She clung to the hope that somewhere within these monsters there remained a capacity for reason, for negotiation. It was all she had ever known, bridges built through words, not violence. The figure across the room didn't even glance at her. The Vexoid scientist hunched over a bank of control panels, his movements efficient, clinical. His gray, wrinkled skin, folded like worn parchment, sagging around his long, narrow neck. Spindly fingers danced across glowing dials, adjusting settings with the patience of someone who believed entirely in the inevitability of his work. He spoke without looking at her, his voice as flat as the sterile walls. "Specimens don't speak." Tyra's heart constricted. Specimen. Not woman, not diplomat, not being. The single word stripped her of identity, reducing her to a thing to be studied, harvested, used. The scientist continued, indifferent. "Your genetic makeup is far too valuable for ransom. The consortium has invested heavily in this program. The outcome must be secured." Her stomach dropped at the words. A program. A plan larger than this room. This was not about random abduction or political leverage. She had been targeted, like others before her, for a purpose she could barely imagine. Her mind flashed back to the night of her capture 3 solar cycles ago. Her diplomatic vessel had been en route to negotiate a trade dispute when the pirates struck. They were precise, efficient, striking with an aggression that suggested far more than opportunism. Now she understood. They had not been pirates at all, but mercenaries under contract. Her people, the lions, were renowned for their unusual genetic adaptability. Across the galaxy, countless species had failed to intermingle biologically, but lions had proven a rare exception. Their DNA was malleable, compatible. Some had once called it a gift of the stars. Others saw it as a resource. To the consortium, it was an opportunity for exploitation. A hiss of hydraulics snapped her attention toward the door. It slid open with mechanical grace, and the shadow that entered filled the room with dread. Nearly 8 feet tall, the Drain male dwarfed the equipment around him. His mottled green-brown scales glistened under the harsh lights, muscles bulging beneath plated skin that resembled armor. His eyes, cold reptilians, scanned Tyra with an appraising detachment as though he were examining livestock. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "A breeding partner," the Drain rumbled, his voice low and resonant. The scientist nodded, still focused on his work. "The specimen is nearly prepared. The sedative will take hold shortly, conscious but compliant." Tyra's throat closed. Breeding partner. The words twisted her stomach into knots. She had lived her life as an ambassador of peace, devoting her existence to building trust across species divides. To be reduced to this, to cattle in a genetic experiment, was a cruelty beyond comprehension. Tears burned behind her eyes. Not here. Not like this. A mechanical arm descended from the ceiling, its movements smooth, deliberate. At its tip glinted a syringe filled with pale blue liquid. The needle caught the light and seemed to mock her desperation. No, Tyra thrashed against her restraints, her entire body shaking as she fought the inevitability. The chair rattled under the violence of her movements, bolts screeching against the floor. "Don't do this." Please, her pleas dissolved into sobs, words lost in the mechanical whir of the descending syringe. The drone folded his arms impassive. The Vexoid scientist tapped a command eye still locked on the data streaming across his panel. Tyra's heart pounded so violently she thought it might burst from her chest. Her entire world had narrowed to the sharp point of the needle, inching closer to her neck. And then the world exploded. The far wall erupted inward, shrapnel and concrete showering the room. A thunderous blast shook the floor beneath her. The sterile lights flickered wildly, replaced by pulsing crimson as alarms blared overhead. Smoke and dust filled the air, choking her lungs. Tyra screamed, eyes wide, as the room transformed from a chamber of violation into a battlefield. Through the haze, a silhouette emerged, smaller than the drain but moving with lethal purpose. A man, armor-clad his frame, battle-scarred his presence, radiating danger. The glint of tactical goggles obscured part of his face, but she saw the rough stubble on his jaw, the grim determination set into his mouth. In his hands he carried a weapon, a pulse rifle unlike any she recognized, modified and lethal. He stepped forward with the calm of someone who had faced death before and never flinched. For a heartbeat, Tyra thought she was hallucinating, that no human could be standing here in this nightmare, cutting through the smoke like an avenging phantom. But then the Vexoid scientist moved, reaching for an alarm panel. Without hesitation, the human fired. The rifle thundered, the report echoing like the voice of judgment. The scientist collapsed lifeless, his pale fluids spreading across the floor. The drone roared in fury, surging forward with terrifying speed. Tyra's scream caught in her throat as the giant closed the distance. But the human did not falter. He sidestepped the charge, dropping his rifle mid-motion, and in a blur drew a combat knife. His movements were too fast to follow steel flashing, blood spraying. The drone's massive body stumbled, clutching at the gaping wound in his throat, then collapsed with a crash that shook the floor. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the wail of alarms. The human turned toward Tyra. Slowly, carefully, he approached, knife-sheathed hands raised in a gesture of reassurance. "Easy," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle amid the carnage. "I'm here. You're going to be okay." For the first time since her captivity began, Tyra felt a spark of something unfamiliar. Hope. Smoke still curled through the shattered wall as the human approached Tyra. His footsteps deliberate but not hurried. He moved like a man who had long ago learned the value of control, never wasting motion, never giving an enemy even the illusion of advantage. The alarms screamed overhead, the sterile red light strobing against the gray armor that hugged his frame. Every dent, every scorch mark on the plating spoke of battles survived, scars carried not on skin, but on steel. Tyra shrank back instinctively as he neared. After everything, the scientist's cruelty, the Draen's looming presence, the inevitability of the syringe, her mind refused to accept this sudden reversal. Could she trust this stranger? Another captor? Another participant in the nightmare? But his voice, soft, grounding, cut through the chaos. "Easy. I'm not here to hurt you." He crouched beside the chair, gloved hands hovering near the restraints but not touching them. The goggles hid his eyes, but she could sense his focus. His presence radiated not indifference like the Vexoid, not hunger like the Draen, but determination. A human determination she had only ever read about in diplomatic briefings, spoken of in hushed tones across council halls. The species that had risen from a small blue planet to carve a place among the stars through sheer stubbornness. A species both feared and underestimated. Her voice quivered. Who are you?" He smiled faintly, just enough to crease the stubble along his jaw. "Name's Eric. Eric Donovan. Independent contractor, you might say." Independent contractor. A mercenary, then. The thought unsettled her, but before she could question him further, he reached into a pouch on his belt and produced a slender tool. With practiced precision, he slid it into the locking mechanism of her right wrist restraint. The cuff clicked open with a metallic snap. Relief flooded her arm, the blood rushing back into her numbed hand. "You're human," she whispered, incredulous. Last time I checked. He moved to her left wrist, his hands steady even as alarms blared around them. Now hold still. These locks can be temperamental. Why the word slipped out before she could stop it? Why would a human risk his life for a lion? For a moment he didn't answer. His brow furrowed slightly, a shadow passing across his features. Then with another sharp click, the second cuff released. He looked at her directly. Finding you wasn't part of the plan, but I'm not the type to walk away from this. The sincerity in his tone startled her more than his sudden appearance. He was here for something else, something bigger. Yet he had chosen to save her when walking away would have been simpler. Eric freed her ankles in quick succession, then stepped back, giving her space. Can you walk? Tyra rubbed at her wrists, wincing as circulation returned. Her legs trembled as she slid from the chair, but she forced herself upright. Yes, I think so. Good. He scooped up his rifle, its weight seeming an extension of his arm, and checked the corridor through the breach he had blasted. His movements carried the efficiency of long practice. This place is about to swarm with security. We have maybe 2 minutes before they lock down the sector. Tyra's knees wobbled, but fear lent her strength. She moved to stand beside him, her diplomat's robes torn and stained, but her posture reclaiming some semblance of dignity. For the first time in days, she was no longer a specimen. She was lion again. Stay close, Eric instructed, his tone shifting to command. Do exactly what I say when I say it. Got it. She swallowed, meeting his steady gaze. Got it. They slipped into the corridor, the air alive with flashing crimson light and the shriek of alarms. Eric moved first, checking corners with a soldier's instinct rifle sweeping arcs of lethal precision. Tyra followed, her heart hammering against her ribs, each step echoing the fragile hope she now carried. As they advanced, she whispered, "What is this place?" "Black Market Research Facility." Eric replied, his voice low but steady. "Consortium funded. They dabble in all sorts of projects, biological weapons, genetic manipulation, breeding programs." The bitterness in his tone when he said the last words made her chest tighten. She understood then he despised what had been done to her as much as she did. Not out of pity, but principle. At the next intersection, Eric raised a fist. Tyra froze, breath caught in her throat. He leaned out just enough to glimpse down the left corridor. The heavy thud of boots echoed closer. "Security," he muttered. 3, maybe 4 guards. Tyra's pulse spiked. What do we do? Instead of answering, Eric reached into another pouch. He produced a small metallic sphere, no bigger than a fruit. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed it down the corridor. A flash erupted, blinding white, followed by a crack like thunder. Shouts and the clatter of weapons followed. "Now we run," he barked, seizing her hand and pulling her into the right corridor. Tyra stumbled but kept pace, her legs fueled by adrenaline. They sprinted through the labyrinth of metal passageways. Twice, Eric forced them into side rooms, holding her against the wall as patrols thundered past. In one room, Tyra recoiled at the sight of another restraint chair identical to the one she had been trapped in. "They're doing this to others," she whispered, horror rising in her throat. "Focus!" Eric snapped, his eyes hard but not unkind. "We can't help them if we get caught." The truth cut deep, but she nodded. Survival first. The facility's voice system blared overhead, automated in cold security breach in Sector 7. Containment protocol initiated. "That's us," Eric muttered grimly. "They're scrambling." They rounded another corner and nearly collided with 2 guards. Massive Taurians, their ridged foreheads, shadowing eyes filled with aggression. Weapons raised. Eric moved before Tyra could even gasp. He ducked under the first guard's swing, slipped inside his reach, and drove his knife into the seam of the alien's armor. Blood sprayed. The second guard raised his weapon too fast for Tyra to think. But instinct surged. She grabbed a metal tray from a nearby cart and hurled it with all her strength. The tray struck the guard's face, knocking his aim astray. His shot scorched the ceiling instead of Eric's chest. Eric twisted his blade, dropping the first Taurian, then spun and fired 2 precise shots into the second. Both bodies collapsed almost simultaneously. Panting, Tyra stared at the fallen guards. Her hands shook from the adrenaline rush. "Nice throw," Eric said, catching his breath. I played disc sport at the Galactic Academy," she stammered, shocked at her own contribution. He allowed himself the faintest smile. "Remind me to challenge you to a game sometime." The levity lasted only a second before his expression hardened again. Hangar bay should be 2 levels down. That's our way out. Together, they pressed on the alarm wails and flashing lights, painting their flight in strokes of chaos. Tyra's body trembled, but her spirit had begun to kindle anew. With each step, she felt less like a victim and more like a survivor. And beside her strode a human whose presence seemed both alien and inevitable, an unexpected savior whose resolve cut through the darkness like a blade. For the first time in days, Hope walked beside her, armed and unyielding. The siren shrieked so loudly Tyra thought her skull might split. Red emergency lights flashed in relentless rhythm, every pulse reminding her that time was running out. The corridors stretched before them like veins of some monstrous machine, cold steel trembling under the boots of approaching guards. Eric moved with predator's grace, his rifle leading every step, his focus unbroken even as chaos closed in from all sides. Tyra kept close behind him, her heart hammering against her ribs like a war drum. They descended a narrow stairwell, the metal groaning under their combined weight. The air stank of ozone and lubricants tinged with the sharp tang of alien blood still drying on Eric's blade. Tyra shivered at the memory, but there was no time to linger. Survival demanded momentum. At the base of the stairwell, Eric froze, raising a clenched fist. Tyra halted instantly, pressing herself against the wall. From the corridor ahead came the thunder of boots, heavily armored, synchronized. A squad. Eric's jaw tightened. He glanced at her, then slipped a hand into his belt pouch, withdrawing 2 small discs. He pressed one into her trembling palm. "When I throw mine shut, your eyes. Cover your ears and count to 3, he whispered. Then run like hell. Don't stop until you see the ship with the red stripe." Tyra swallowed, nodding despite the dread that crawled up her throat. She could feel the weight of the disc, cold metal, humming faintly in her hand. Eric exhaled the breath of a man accustomed to placing himself between danger and those who couldn't fight. He stepped forward, kicked the stairwell door open, and hurled his disc into the oncoming squad. Tyra mirrored his action, tossing hers down the opposite branch of the corridor. The world erupted. 2 blinding flashes detonated with concussive force, rattling the walls. The air itself seemed to shiver. Tyra clapped her hands over her ears and squeezed her eyes shut, silently counting 1, 2, 3. "Go!" Eric's voice cut through the ringing in her head. She bolted forward, adrenaline surging like fire in her veins. Eric's hand closed around hers, dragging her at breakneck speed. Shouts echoed behind them, confused, disoriented. The traps had worked. The corridors became a blur of metal and light. Twice they nearly collided with patrols, but Eric's reflexes were faster than thought. He shoved Tyra into side alcoves, his body shielding hers, as guards thundered past, blind to their presence. In one alcove, Tyra's gaze landed on another restraint chair identical to the one that had held her. Empty now, but waiting. A shudder tore through her. "They're doing this to others," she whispered, her voice shaking. Eric's eyes flashed. "We'll come back for them, but if we die here, no one gets saved." The cold truth cut deeper than any blade, but she nodded. Resolve settled heavy in her chest. At last, they reached the hangar bay doors. Eric pressed his back to the wall, rifle-ready eyes scanning the electronic lock. Through the narrow window, Tyra saw the vast chamber beyond, ships lined up like beasts in cages, engines dormant but ready to roar. Between them and freedom stood 6 guards in formation, weapons raised, eyes fixed on the sealed doorway. "They're expecting us," Eric muttered. Tyra's breath hitched. "Can we find another way?" No time. He checked his pouches, pulling out 2 more discs, different from before. Pulse charges, non-lethal. Think of them as very rude invitations to stop breathing for a while. Her lips parted in awe at his calm, his matter-of-fact way of treating danger. It was as though the battlefield was his natural environment, chaos, the air he breathed. "Close your eyes, cover your ears again," he ordered. He swung the door open with a violent kick and hurled both discs. Tyra obeyed, but even through shut eyes and covered ears, she felt the blast. The air buckled. The floor shook, a thunderclap of energy surging outward. "Run," Eric roared. They sprinted into the hangar, smoke and chaos shrouding the chamber. Guards staggered, blinded, and deafened, their weapons clattering to the floor. Eric fired in precise bursts, each shot finding its mark. Tyra's lungs burned as she raced alongside him, her diplomat's robes tangling around her legs, but she refused to stumble. The ship loomed ahead, compact and angular, its hull marked with a distinctive red stripe. The boarding ramp hung open like a promise. A bolt of energy sizzled past Tyra's ear, the heat searing her skin. Another struck near her feet, sending sparks showering upward. She gasped but didn't slow. Eric reached the ramp, first spinning to lay down covering fire. "Move," he barked. Tyra hurled herself forward. Pain flared across her shoulder as a stray shot grazed her, but she forced her legs to keep pumping. 3 more strides and she collapsed onto the ramp, the metal biting into her palms. Eric backpedaled, still firing his stance unshakable. When he finally crossed the threshold, he slammed his fist against the control panel. The ramp began to close, locking them inside. "Cockpit second seat," he commanded. Tyra staggered upright, clutching her wounded shoulder, and stumbled down the narrow corridor. The cockpit glowed ahead, panels flickering to life under Eric's swift hands as he vaulted into the pilot's chair. She dropped into the co-pilot's seat, struggling to fasten the harnesses as the ship hummed, thrusters whining. "Hang on," Eric muttered, gripping the flight controls. "This is going to be rough." The ship lifted, engines roaring as it clawed free of the hangar. Tyra's stomach lurched as they blasted into open space. The massive ring-shaped station loomed behind them, its sleek design marred by fire and smoke from their assault. "They're launching fighters," Eric warned, banking the ship hard. Tyra clutched her seat as the stars twisted. 4, no 5 of them. "Can we outrun them?" Eric's lips curved into the faintest grin. "We can do better." He flipped switches overhead, hands moving with instinctive precision. "See that red button to your right? When I say now, hold it for 3 seconds. The ship shuddered as enemy fire lanced across their shields. Warning lights blazed crimson. Eric's eyes never left the displays. Almost now. Tyra slammed her hand onto the button. For a breath, nothing happened. Then the space behind them erupted with a cascade of flashes. "What was that?" she gasped. "Magnetic pulse mines," Eric replied. "Disables their systems temporarily. Won't kill them, but it buys us breathing room." The pursuing fighters spun out of formation, systems faltering. Eric seized the moment, pulling a lever. Stars stretched into elongated lines as hyperspace swallowed them whole. For the first time since her capture, Tyra exhaled a ragged breath of relief. Her body trembled, but she was alive and free. Eric glanced at her wound, jaw tightening. "First aid kit under your seat. Can you manage?" "I can." She retrieved the kit, fumbling with trembling fingers. "But why, Eric? Why risk this? You could have left me." He was silent for a long moment, eyes fixed on the stars streaming past. Then quietly, "Some lines you don't cross. Some things you don't ignore. Not if you want to stay human." The words sank deep, resonating in her chest. For the first time, Tyra allowed herself to believe that survival might be possible. That hope was not a foolish dream, but something real, something embodied in the human beside her. The hum of the ship's engines filled the silence like a heartbeat, steady and reassuring. Tyra sat rigid in the co-pilot's chair, her trembling hands fumbling with the straps of the first aid kit. Her shoulder throbbed where the plasma bolt had grazed her every pulse of pain, reminding her how close she had come to oblivion. Yet compared to what had awaited her in that laboratory, this pain was a blessing. Eric's hands danced across the controls, recalibrating systems that had groaned under the weight of pursuit. The man hardly seemed phased, as if slipping through fire and death was routine. His jaw was set, eyes hidden behind tactical goggles that now reflected only the streaming blur of hyperspace. He hadn't spoken since that quiet admission. "Some lines you don't cross." The words lingered in the cockpit, echoing louder than the alarms that had filled the corridors behind them. Tyra forced herself to focus. She tore open a sterile bandage and pressed it against her wound, biting back a hiss. The sharp sting grounded her, gave her something to hold on to amid the chaos of emotions surging inside. When she finally found her voice, it emerged softer than she intended. "You didn't answer me." Eric didn't glance away from the controls. "Didn't I?" "You told me why you couldn't leave me," she pressed, "but not what you were really doing there in the first place. You didn't storm that facility by accident." The faintest of smiles touched his mouth, though it held no humor. "You're sharper than most I've pulled out of hellholes like that." Her heart quickened. "So I wasn't your mission." No, his voice was flat, unflinching. I was hired to retrieve stolen research data, bioweapon development, cutting-edge stuff the consortium's been playing with. Dangerous enough that some people with deep pockets wanted it out of their hands. Tyra gripped the edges of her seat, and instead you found me. Eric finally turned his head, meeting her gaze. His goggles had shifted slightly during the fight, revealing eyes that were not cold, as she'd feared, but tired, haunted by things unsaid. Yeah, and leaving you there wasn't an option. Her throat tightened. She wanted to thank him, but the words seemed wholly inadequate. Gratitude felt too small for what he had done, for what he had risked. Instead, she whispered, "What exactly was in that data?" Eric tapped a pouch strapped securely to his belt. Enough to make my client happy, but also enough to make my blood run cold. He hesitated, then added, "It's about the program, the one they intended you for." Tyra's stomach lurched. She had suspected, but hearing it aloud made her skin crawl. "Tell me." He exhaled slowly as though bracing himself. "The consortium isn't just interested in making weapons. They're trying to make soldiers hybrids. Cross-species combinations designed for combat. Your people's genetics are, well, let's just say they're considered the golden key. Adaptable, compatible, resilient. They can splice you with just about anything, and it'll hold." A chill spread through her veins, colder than the sterile lab had ever been. "So that's why. Why me? Not just you." The data mentioned others. Dozens, maybe hundreds taken from across the galaxy. They want strength from the Drawn intelligence, from the Vexoid adaptability, from the Lions. Mix and match until they've built the perfect army. His lip curled with disgust. An army bred, not born. Tyra pressed her palms against her knees, grounding herself. "We've always been diplomats," she murmured. "Our adaptability was meant for peace, for building bridges, and they would twist it into this." Eric's expression softened just for a heartbeat. "I'm sorry." Before she could reply, a shrill alarm blared from the console. Eric's head snapped around his hands, flying over the controls. "What is it?" Tyra asked, dread coiling in her chest. "The kind of problem that shouldn't be possible." He pointed to a blinking indicator on the display. "Something's following us. In hyperspace." Her brow furrowed. "That's theoretical at best. Tracking inside hyperspace has never been proven." "Well, looks like someone just proved it." His jaw clenched. Consortium must have developed new tech. Probably the same people pushing the boundaries in genetic labs. Tyra's breath quickened. "How long until they intercept us?" Eric pulled up a holographic star chart, a crimson line tracing their current trajectory. A pulsing dot appeared behind them, inching closer. "At their current speed, 40 minutes. Her stomach dropped. "Can we fight them?" "Not head on. Not in this ship." He studied the map, then tapped a small, unremarkable system near the edge. "Helios Minor, mining colony, independent territory. Not under consortium control. I've got contacts there. Safe, safer than floating out here waiting to be caught." He adjusted the course, the ship shuddering as his hyperspace vector shifted. Tyra steadied herself against the back of his chair, watching his hands blur across the controls. Every movement was precise, honed by years of experience. He was no mere mercenary, he was a soldier. "You never told me," she said softly. "Where did you learn to fly like that?" "Earth Defense Force. 8 years tactical pilot. Left when the politics got thicker than the armor plating." He didn't look up. "I prefer choosing my own battles now." There was something in his tone, a shadow, an unspoken weight. Tyra didn't press. She had her own shadows. Minutes bled into silence, broken only by the hum of the engines and the occasional beep of the console. Tyra found herself watching him, studying the lines of his face, the quiet strength in his posture. This man who had shattered her cage, who had cut down monsters with the ease of breathing, carried his own invisible chains. Finally, she asked, "Why did you really help me? You could have completed your mission, taken the data, and gone." For a long time, he didn't answer. His eyes remained fixed on the starfield ahead, streaks of light rushing past. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. "Because some things you don't ignore, some crimes you don't walk past. Not if you want to keep calling yourself human." The words struck her harder than any plasma bolt. Not human as a species, but human as a choice, as a moral line. Tyra looked down at her hands, still shaking from adrenaline. And for the first time since her capture, she smiled faintly. Fragile but real. Then perhaps she said softly, "There's more humanity in you than in the entire consortium combined." Eric allowed himself a brief chuckle, rough around the edges. "Don't go putting me on any pedestals. I'm just a man trying not to drown in a galaxy gone mad." But when their eyes met, something unspoken passed between them. Not gratitude, not debt, something deeper: recognition. Two souls carved by different paths meeting at the same impossible crossroads. The console beeped again, reminding them of the chase. Eric straightened, returning to business. "We've bought ourselves time, but not much. Helios Minor's still 10 hours out. Get some rest while you can." Tyra hesitated, then nodded. Rising from the chair, she placed a hand lightly on his shoulder. "Thank you, Eric. Not just for rescuing me, but for seeing me. Not as a specimen, not as a prize. As me." His hand rose to cover hers, warm and solid. "Get some sleep, Tyra. Tomorrow's going to be hell." She withdrew, retreating down the corridor toward the crew quarters. Yet even as exhaustion pulled at her bones, her heart beat with something she had not felt since before her capture. Trust, and perhaps, just perhaps, the faintest flicker of hope. Helios Minor hung against the backdrop of the void like a wounded jewel, a tarnished copper coin orbiting its weary star. Its surface was scarred with centuries of mining operations, open pits gaping like wounds, refineries clinging to the crust like parasites, and spaceports and sprawling in haphazard patches across its battered crust. From orbit, it looked less like a thriving colony and more like a scar that had refused to heal. Tyra pressed her face close to the viewport as the ship descended, her silver-white hair falling forward. She tried to see beauty in the chaos below, as she had been trained to do as a diplomat. "It has its own charm," she offered diplomatically. Eric smirked faintly from the pilot's seat. "If your idea of charm is rust grit and the smell of burned ozone, then yeah, this place is practically a honeymoon destination." She shot him a sideways look, but he was already focused on the landing sequence. With practiced ease, he guided the ship into the thickening atmosphere. The vessel shuddered as it hit turbulence, then steadied. The sprawling complex of Nova Haven came into view, domes and towers linked by conduits, ringed by landing pads and docking bays. Lights blinked across its surface like fireflies, while smokestacks pumped exhaust into the sky. As they descended, Eric's expression hardened. "We'll need to be careful. The consortium doesn't have official presence here, but that doesn't mean they don't have informants. A mining colony like this is a magnet for spies, bounty hunters, and opportunists." "Informants," Tyra repeated, pulling her cloak tighter around her shoulders. "Word spreads fast when there's credits on the line. And after what I pulled back there, I'd bet my ship there's already a price on our heads." The ship settled onto a landing pad in one of the colony's less reputable districts, the kind where broken cargo containers served as makeshift housing and graffiti scrawled across bulkheads warned outsiders to tread lightly. Eric powered down the engines, then reached into a compartment and pulled out a hooded cloak. "Wear this," he instructed, handing it to her. "Your blue skin stands out like a flare, and while I happen to think it's striking, it'll get us both killed if the wrong eyes notice." Tyra accepted the cloak, draping it around herself. Its coarse fabric scratched against her arms, but it concealed her well enough. She pulled the hood low. "And you?" Eric tapped his sidearm and smirked. "Let's just say humans are common enough out here. As long as I keep my head down, no one will ask too many questions." They disembarked, stepping into the tumult of Nova Haven. The air was thick with industrial smoke, laced with the tang of exotic foods and the sweat of countless species. Merchants barked from stalls, hawking everything from mining equipment to black market cybernetics. Dock workers shouted over the hiss of unloading freighters, while miners trudged through the crowd, their faces streaked with dust. Eric led the way, his stride purposeful. Tyra followed close, keeping her head down, but her senses alert. The cacophony overwhelmed her after days of sterile silence. The chaotic noise of life was almost dizzying. They wound through narrow alleys and across crowded plazas until they reached a nondescript building with a faded sign that simply read, "Harlow's." It looked like a cross between a bar, an equipment shop, and a den of secrets. Inside, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations dulled as the patrons glanced up at the newcomers. A few narrowed their eyes, but most returned to their drinks. Behind the counter stood a burly man with a cybernetic left arm and scars crisscrossing his weathered face. His gaze sharpened when it landed on Eric. "Well, I'll be damned," he rumbled, his voice gravel over steel. "Eric Donovan. Thought you'd be dead by now." "Not for lack of trying," Eric replied with a smirk. "Need to talk, privately." Harlow's eyes flicked to Tyra, still cloaked. Suspicion lingered there, but after a moment he nodded toward a door at the back. "Office is open. Don't touch my good whiskey." The back room was cluttered but organized, weapon parts, neatly stacked data pads arranged in tidy rows, and star charts plastered across the walls. Harlow dropped heavily into a chair behind a desk. "Who's your friend?" Eric gestured to Tyra. "Show him." She hesitated, then lowered her hood. Her luminous blue skin and silver hair caught the dim light, casting an otherworldly glow. Harlow let out a low whistle. "Lion diplomat, by the looks of it. You always did know how to complicate things, Donovan." Eric gave a humorless chuckle. "Story of my life." Briefly, he recounted what had happened: the facility, the breeding program, the escape, the stolen data. Harlow listened without interruption, his expression growing darker with each word. When Eric finished, Harlow leaned back in his chair, exhaling heavily. "You've stepped into a storm this time. The consortium doesn't tolerate interference, especially not with projects of this scale." "How bad is it?" Tyra asked quietly. Harlow tapped a data pad. A bounty notice flickered onto the projection above the desk. "Bad enough that there's already a price on both your heads. 500,000 credits for Donovan, 1 million for you, Princess, alive only." Tyra's breath caught. 1 million credits, more than most colonies saw in a decade. Eric swore softly. "They move faster than I expected." "They want her back," Harlow said grimly, "and they want whatever you stole." Eric pulled the secure pouch from his belt and placed it on the desk. "Let's see what I've got." Harlow connected it to a secure reader. Holographic data spilled into the airlines of code schematics, genetic diagrams. The three of them leaned closer, faces illuminated by the glow. What Tyra saw made her blood run cold. The consortium wasn't merely experimenting. They were building an army. Hybrid soldiers with traits cherry-picked from multiple species, strength, intelligence, adaptability. Lions were at the core of it, their DNA the binding agent. But what chilled her most was the scale. Dozens of facilities, hundreds of captives. Viable embryos already in gestation, first-generation hybrids nearly ready. "This is genocide," she whispered. "They're weaponizing entire species. And they're close to succeeding," Harlow added grimly. Eric's jaw tightened. "Then we need to get this information out. Someone who can stop them. The Galactic Council, maybe." Tyra offered, though, her voice faltered. Harlow shook his head. "The Council's compromise. Look." He scrolled further through the data, highlighting names, stakeholders, financial backers. Among them were council members, even representatives from Tyra's own Astral Council. The revelation struck like a physical blow. Her own people complicit. Tyra's knees wavered and she gripped the edge of the desk to steady herself. "I'm sorry," Eric murmured, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. His touch was grounding warm against her trembling skin. Harlow's gaze was hard. "There's something else here. Security protocols for the central breeding facility. If you can get inside, you could shut it down permanently." Eric frowned. "That's a suicide mission." Maybe, Harlow admitted. "But if we expose this to the public, every planet, every colony, every outpost, the consortium won't be able to hide. Even their allies on the council will be forced to distance themselves." Tyra lifted her head, eyes burning with renewed fire. "Then that's what we must do. Broadcast the data, expose them." Eric studied her, something shifting in his expression. Respect, admiration, perhaps something deeper. He nodded slowly. "All right, but first we resupply and find someone who can reach the deep space relays." "I know someone," Harlow said. Former communications specialist. Works with the mining guild now. She has access to the relay. If anyone can help, it's her." The decision was made. But as they prepared to leave Harlow's office, the weight of the revelation pressed heavy on Tyra's heart. Her people, her council, had betrayed her. Yet beside her stood a human mercenary who had risked everything for a stranger. That night in the safe house, Harlow provided exhaustion finally caught up with them. The structure was small and bare, a couch, a washroom, a single bedroom. Eric secured the door set, perimeter alarms, then slumped onto the couch with a sigh. Tyra sank down beside him, the events of the day crashing over her. She stared at her hands, words caught in her throat. Finally, she whispered, I still can't believe my own counsel would be involved. Everything I dedicated my life to feels broken. Eric turned to her, his expression softer than she had ever seen it. You're not responsible for their choices, but you are responsible for what you do next. And right now, you're choosing to fight back. Their eyes met. The connection between them, fragile in the cockpit, now burned stronger. Tyra reached for his hand, her fingers trembling as they brushed his. He didn't pull away. Instead, his thumb traced gentle circles on her skin. For the first time, she let her defenses fall. Why did you help me, Eric? The truth. He looked away for a moment, jaw tight. 5 years ago, I was part of an operation with the consortium. We thought we were shutting down pirates. In reality, we were delivering prisoners test subjects. By the time I realized it was too late, dozens taken, I tried to stop it, but I was court-martialed, dishonorably discharged. Couldn't save them, but I swore I'd never let it happen again. Tyra's breath caught. She reached up, cupping his cheek. You're a good man, Eric Donovan, even if you don't believe it. He gave a bitter smile. I've done my share of questionable things. Haven't we all? She whispered. The space between them shrank, the air charged with unspoken longing, with the weight of survival and the fire of defiance. Eric's gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes, a question lingering. Tyra answered not with words, but by leaning forward, pressing her lips to his. The kiss was tentative, at first cautious. But then it deepened, years of loneliness, and the intensity of shared danger igniting into something undeniable. His arms circled her, strong and protective. Her hands traced the lines of his shoulders, memorizing the strength beneath. In that small, worn room, they found not escape, but affirmation. They were alive. They were free, if only for tonight. And in their union, they reclaimed what the consortium had tried to strip from them: agency, desire, humanity. Later, as they lay entwined, the 3 moons of Helios Minor casting silver light through the narrow window, Tyra rested her head on Eric's chest. She listened to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, stronger than any alarm, more comforting than any promise. What happens tomorrow? She asked softly. Eric's fingers traced lazy patterns along her spine. We meet we broadcast the data. Then, we figure out how to get you home. And you? His silence was heavy, thoughtful. Finally, he whispered, I haven't thought that far. She lifted her head, gazing down at him. Come with me to Lyria. My people, those who are not corrupted, would protect you. And I could use someone like you. He chuckled softly. Me, at a diplomatic council, I don't exactly do speeches. You've already proven persuasive, she teased, brushing her lips against his again. His smile was brief but real. Let's survive tomorrow first, then we can talk about the future. Tyra nodded, her heart fuller than it had been in years. For the first time since her captivity, she allowed herself to dream of tomorrow. Dawn spilled copper light across the jagged skyline of Nova Haven. The colony stirred awake beneath the red sun, miners trudging toward their shifts, merchants preparing stalls, children darting through alleys before the streets grew too dangerous. To them, it was just another day of labor and survival. To Tyra and Eric, it was the day the galaxy might change forever. Inside Harlow's safe house, Eric stood by the window, scanning the streets below through battered blinds. His mind calculated every risk, every possible ambush, every way this mission could end in disaster. Behind him, Tyra emerged from the small bedroom, her silver hair loose around her shoulders, her diplomat's cloak pulled once more into place. The intimacy of the previous night lingered in her eyes, but now they carried new fire determination, sharp enough to cut steel. Any word from Harlow, she asked. Eric shook his head. Not yet, but Reese agreed to meet us at the auxiliary communications tower. Harlow says she has clearance access to the deep space relay. Can we trust her? Harlow vouches for her, Eric said, turning from the window. That'll have to be enough. Before Tyra could respond, the emergency communicator on the table buzzed to life. Harlow's voice came through, harsh and hurried. Consortium's moving. They've locked down the main spaceport, bringing in reinforcements. You need to move now. Ree's waiting at the East Quadrant Tower, Sector 7. It's your only shot. Understood, Eric replied. What about you? Don't worry about me. Get that data broadcast. The line cut. Eric pocketed the device, his jaw set. He turned to Tyra. We move. The tower, the auxiliary communications tower, loomed above the industrial sprawl, a spire of steel bristling with antennae and relay dishes. It looked innocuous enough blending into the patchwork skyline, but Tyra could feel the weight of its significance. If they succeeded here, the consortium's secrets would no longer be secrets. Every world would know. If they failed, their lives and the lives of countless captives would be snuffed out in silence. A figure detached from the shadows near the base of the tower as they approached. A woman with cropped hair and the calm movements of a soldier stepped forward. She wore the plain clothes of a guild worker, but her eyes were sharp. Eric asked cautiously. She nodded once. Harlow sent you. You have the data. Eric patted the secure pouch on his belt. Right here. Good. Consortium's already sweeping the sectors. We don't have long. She led them to a side entrance, swiping an access card. The door hissed open and they slipped inside. The climb was grueling. Narrow stairwells and maintenance ladders spiraled endlessly upward, each level a maze of cables and humming machinery. The air grew hot and metallic, thick with the vibration of power flowing through the tower's veins. Tyra's legs burned, but she kept pace, her breath steady. Fear and adrenaline drove her forward. At last, they reached the broadcast suite, a control room near the top walls lined with consoles and glowing panels. Through a viewport, Nova Haven sprawled below, tiny figures scurrying like ants, consortium ships, dark specks against the sky. This is it, Reese said, sliding into the operator's chair. Emergency broadcast systems. I can override and push your data across every channel, military, civilian, commercial. Once it starts, they can't stop it. But they will trace it here. How long, Eric asked. Full data package, 8 minutes. Eric nodded grimly. Then we hold this room for 8 minutes. The siege reconnected the data drive and began typing commands, her fingers flying. A warning light blinked red. They've already detected unauthorized access, she said. We're on the clock. Eric moved to the doorway, rifle ready. Tyra positioned herself on the opposite side, a small blaster in hand. Her stomach twisted, but she forced her diplomat's mind into a soldier's role. She had no choice. The first footsteps echoed up the stairwell, a squad of armored consortium agents, their weapons heavy and deadly. Eric leaned out, fired 2 precise shots, and dropped the first pair before they could react. The others ducked behind cover, returning fire. Energy bolts scorched the walls, filling the room with acrid smoke. Tyra pressed herself against the frame, hard hammering. She leaned out, squeezed the trigger. Her bolt clipped an agent's shoulder, sending him sprawling. She ducked back, breath shaking, but a surge of pride lit her chest. She could fight. She would fight. 40%, transmitted Reese shouted over the firefight. Another wave of agents surged up the corridor, using fallen comrades as shields. The firefight intensified, bolts sizzling past Eric's head, chunks of wall erupting into molten slag. He fired methodically, each shot a calculated answer to chaos. They're trying to cut power to the tower, Ree warned. Systems are holding, but not for long. Eric ejected a spent cell, slammed a new one into his rifle. We need fallback options. Ree, any other exit? Maintenance shaft behind that panel, she said, pointing. Leads to the roof. There's an emergency shuttle up there. Good, Eric muttered. If it comes to it, we run. No, Ree said firmly, not looking up from her console. Someone has to stay to keep the transmission live. If they override me, it dies. Tyra turned sharply. We're not leaving you. Ree's eyes flicked up, resolute. This is bigger than me, bigger than any of us. I'll hold the signal. Eric swore under his breath, but there was no time to argue. The air suddenly vibrated with a new sound, a high-pitched whine that sent chills down Tyra's spine. Eric's eyes widened. They're bringing up a disruptor. What is that? Tyra demanded. Neural disruptor, he said grimly. Military grade. It'll fry every nervous system in this tower. Ours, theirs, doesn't matter. 60%, transmitted Ree cried. The wall shook as the disruptor charged. Sparks rained from damaged panels. Eric sprinted to the far side of the room, yanking open a maintenance hatch to reveal a tangle of power conduits. What are you doing? Tyra shouted, firing blindly down the corridor to keep the agents at bay. Something stupid, Eric muttered, hands moving fast as he rerouted wires. Sweat poured down his temple, his stubble shadow dark with grime. Towers like this have capacitors to protect against lightning strikes. If I can redirect. The disruptor's whine peaked. Commander Vex's voice boomed from the smoke-filled corridor. Surrender the lion specimen and the stolen data, and you will be allowed to live. Tyra's eyes narrowed. Specimen, she spat, her voice raw. She shouted back, not a chance, 90% recalled. The whine became a scream. Eric's hands flew snapping wires into place. Get behind cover. Now. Tyra grabbed Ree's arm, pulling her down behind the console. Eric dove beside them just as the disruptor fired. A blinding flash seared the room. For a heartbeat, Tyra thought she was dead, thought her mind had shattered under the neural blast. But then the tower groaned, shuddered, and outside the viewport, explosions rippled through the consortium's ranks. Eric's gamble had worked. He had rerouted the energy back into the disruptor itself, turning the weapon inward. The blast cascaded downward, tearing through enemy equipment in a chain of detonations. Smoke filled the stairwell as agents fled, their screams drowned out by collapsing steel. Ree peeked over the console, eyes wide. You reversed the disruptor. Eric grinned through blood streaking his cheek. Earth defense training. When outgunned, use the enemy's strength against them. Tyra's chest swelled, equal parts awe and relief. Humanity indeed. Transmission complete. Ree checked her console, her hands trembling. It's done. The data's out. Transmitted across every major relay in the sector. By now, it's already spreading system to system. The consortium can't contain it. But a new alarm shrieked. Ree's face fell. They're sending ships. A blockade. We need to move now. Eric helped Tyra to her feet. Roof, shuttle, move. They sprinted to the maintenance shaft, climbing the final distance. The hatch opened to the roof, wind whipping around them. The shuttle waited, small but functional, its systems blinking. Ree stopped short. I'm not coming. Harlow's still down there, and the miners will need someone to organize resistance. This is my home. Tyra gripped her hand, eyes burning. Are you sure? Ree nodded. She handed Eric a data chip. Coordinates to a resistance outpost. Safe jump point. They'll get you to Lyria. Eric accepted it with a nod. Tell Harlow he still owes me a drink. Ree smiled, then turned back toward the chaos below. Eric and Tyra boarded the shuttle. Engines roared to life as explosions shook the base of the tower. Eric pushed the throttle and the vessel launched skyward, climbing fast into Nova Haven's thin atmosphere. On the tactical display, consortium ships moved to intercept, but Eric's hands were already flying across the controls, weaving the shuttle through gaps in their formation. Tyra strapped herself in, heart racing. Will we make it? Eric's jaw set, his voice steel. We'll make it. The shuttle clawed its way through Nova Haven's atmosphere, engines straining against gravity and consortium pursuit alike. The sky burned crimson with the rising sun, smoke trails from the collapsing communications tower streaking upward like dark scars. Eric gripped the controls with iron focus, weaving the craft through the turbulence. Beside him, Tyra clutched her harness, her eyes fixed on the tactical display. 2 interceptors closing fast, she reported, voice taut. Weapons lock in 30 seconds. Eric's lips curved into a grim smile. Let them try. The shuttle jolted violently as the first salvo of energy bolts sliced past. Sparks leapt from the console, warning lights flaring red. Shields down to 50%. The tiny craft wasn't built for dogfights. Every maneuver Eric made pushed the shuttle beyond safe tolerances, the hull groaning under the stress. Eric, Tyra shouted as another blast skimmed the rear. One more hit like that. Won't happen, he cut in, eyes burning with intensity. He slammed the thrusters, throwing the shuttle into a brutal spiral. The interceptors overshot their targeting systems, confused by the sudden vector shift. Eric seized the moment, cutting power to the engines for a heartbeat before reigniting them at full burn. The shuttle lurched forward, slipping between the enemy's firing arcs. Tyra's hands gripped the armrests until her knuckles turned pale blue. And yet amid the terror, she felt a strange exhilaration. Eric was not just flying, he was fighting every movement, a refusal to surrender, every risk a statement of defiance. Jump point ahead, Eric growled. 20 seconds. The interceptors realigned, firing again. One bolt struck the shields, directly sending a shudder through the shuttle. Alarm screamed. Shields at 20%, Tyra cried. Eric ignored the warnings, his whole being focused on the countdown. 15 seconds. 10. A final barrage lit the void beams of lethal light converging on their tiny craft. Eric pulled a maneuver so sharp the shuttle screamed in protest, cutting power again, dropping the vessel into freefall before slamming the engines back online. The blast sailed harmlessly past, colliding in an explosion that blinded the pursuing ships for a fraction of a second. It was all the opening they needed. 3, 2, 1. Eric slammed the jump controls, space warp stars stretching into brilliant lines. The shuttle lurched, then vanished into the safety of hyperspace. Silence followed, heavy, profound, broken only by the hum of the engines. Eric let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his hands loosening on the controls. Tyra exhaled shakily, her body trembling with adrenaline. "We made it," she whispered. "Told you we would," Eric said, finally allowing himself a wry smile. They sat in silence for a long moment, the glow of hyperspace painting their faces in shifting blues and silvers. The galaxy outside seemed infinite, full of danger, but also of promise. "The resistance outpost is 6 hours from here," Eric said, tapping the data chip Ree had given him. "We can resupply, regroup, and get you back to Lyria." Tyra turned to him, her expression softening. "And you, what will you do?" He hesitated, eyes locked on the swirling tunnel of hyperspace. "The galaxy's changing. The consortium will bleed after this, but they'll fight back hard. Your people will need allies, fighters, someone who knows how to bend rules." He gave a half shrug. "I was thinking I might stick around, if there's a place for someone like me." Her smile was radiant, brighter than the streaking stars. "The Lyrian diplomatic corps could use someone with your unconventional methods." Eric barked a laugh. "Me a diplomat?" "Why not?" she teased, leaning closer. "You've already persuaded me." The laughter faded, replaced by something deeper in his gaze. "Is that the only reason you want me to stay?" he asked quietly. Tyra leaned in, her lips inches from his, not even close. Their kiss was soft, but full of unspoken promises. When they parted, Eric rested his forehead against hers, his smile carrying both weariness and hope. "Then I guess I'm about to become a diplomat," he murmured. "Among other things," Tyra replied with a mischievous glint in her eyes. As the shuttle carried them toward the resistance, Eric reflected on the strange path that had brought him here. A job meant to steal data had turned into something far greater, the exposure of a galactic conspiracy, the birth of an alliance, the spark of a bond he had never expected. For Tyra, the ordeal had taken everything: her freedom, her trust, her certainty. But it had also given her something new, a partner who saw her not as a specimen or a pawn, but as a person. Together they carried not only stolen data, but also the fragile seed of hope. The consortium would not fall easily. There would be battles, betrayals, resistance from all sides. But as Eric glanced at Tyra, blue skin glowing in the light of hyperspace, he felt certainty settle into his bones. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And that, more than any weapon or plan, was worth fighting for.